Mr. Blair, have you been encouraged by the results so far?
Tony Blair now leaving Marabella, his house.
Let's just wait and see, shall we?
Still being cautious, let's just wait and see. He'll be only the 5th Labour Prime Minister this century if he gets this job.
We got onto the plane, and I had my pager. It was going like, Labour gain, Labour gain, Labour gain, Labour gain.
You know, as the results rolled in, at a point I even remember thinking, come on, the Tories have got to win a few seats, otherwise this is like, it's a complete wipeout. And I remember Cherie just sort of taking me by the hand and saying, look, it's of course it's going to be really difficult, but, you know, we can do it together. It's such a strange feeling. When I remember it now, it was probably wise that I didn't participate in all the exhilaration and euphoria and adulation, because it was never ever going to last, was it?
Gordon Brown has ruled himself out of the contest.
Tony Blair is elected leader of Labour.
Mr. Brown, having wanted to step in for so long, now gets the opportunity.
Good evening. Tonight, at last, we hear the voters' verdict. The opinion polls through this campaign are borne out tonight. We're likely to see one of the biggest political upsets since the Tories were swept out of office in 1945.
None of us could relax. We just thought, well, any lack of focus, you know, if we shifted our attention, if we allowed our minds to wander, you know, something would go wrong.
There it is, 10 o'clock, and we say Tony Blair is to be Prime Minister and a landslide is likely. And reaction from Sedgefield already in the Labour Club. Let's now hear from John Simpson, who's with Alistair Campbell. John.
We'd agreed that when we got to the count at Sedgefield, Tony would do an interview with John Simpson. And we got to the count, and for all sorts of reasons, Tony just said, he kind of basically said, I can't be bothered. So they said, would I do it?
Tony Blair came here, he wouldn't say anything, but with us at the moment for an informal chat, I'm told, is Alistair Campbell, his press spokesman. Alistair, you've won, haven't you?
Well, Mr. Blair's constituency is not yet declared, but I think we're having a pretty good night.
I am generally, I'm not a cautious person, but I'm very, I probably am always looking for the worst thing to happen. And if you see that interview, I was not in the zone at all.
Can I tempt you to saying how much? But I mean, it's going to be substantial.
Well, it looks like we've had a good night.
I was in Scotland with Gordon. We had to do a photo call. By then, I think most people realised it was going to be a pretty big victory.
Mr. Brown, good evening. Thank you for joining us. Well, it looks as though you're going to be Chancellor of the Exchequer by tomorrow afternoon.
Well, I think we'll wait and see. It looks as if Labour has done very well, but I was the one who said to all our candidates on Monday, take nothing for granted, and I will stick that way for the time being.
No complacency was the mantra. The older members of the team had huge disappointments, and they were, to the point of paranoia, cautious.
We were watching it on television, all these results starting to come through, and they switched to what was happening at Millbank Tower, and the people were getting really excited there. And Tony said to me, tell them they've got to tone it down. And I said, you know, these people think we're going to win, Tony.
A new dawn has broken, has it not? We have been elected as New Labour, and we will govern as New Labour.
everybody was just out. It was 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, and everybody was there.
Neil Kinnock was suddenly popping up and rejoicing, and you saw Peter Mandelson dancing, and Angie gives you a hug out the blue. So it was sort of mayhem.
You really did start to feel that one of those once-in-a-generation sea changes in politics was underway.
The expectations were so high. I was about the only sober person around. And I remember meeting someone in the early hours and them saying to me, you know, everything is now possible. And I said in a rather irritated way, like what? Because, you know, what do you mean everything's possible? I mean, it's going to be a lot more difficult than that.
There was a cascade of people coming out of houses and offices. That was the first time I got this sense of actually, this has happened and people are really, really, really happy about it.
Today, enough of talking. It is time now to do. Thank you.
I felt an enormous sense of trepidation. Of course, this was my first job in government. I was Prime Minister. I had no experience of government. Virtually nobody in the Labour Party, because we've been 18 years in opposition, had any experience of government. And I remember going into Downing Street, very conscious of this lack of experience.
Tony finished his speech. He's doing his wave and the family and Cherie's there, and it's all lovely. But I could see he had a hesitation. And I knew it. The door. How does the door open? And I didn't know how the door opened. There's a camera outside the door in Downing Street, and a security guard, a custodian inside, who has a screen, who looks at that. The moment the Prime Minister turns around, he opens the door.
I remember that day. I got into the Treasury and I was very surprised because I'd never expected a welcome. But I just wanted to get down to business.
I was the senior civil servant in the Treasury, and I immediately went into a meeting with him and his private secretary and with Ed.
Well, welcome to the Treasury.
I think Terry thought we were going to go through a sort of meet and greet, you know, how the place functioned, look at some organisational charts. And instead, Gordon says, Terry, we have a draft letter which we want to send to the Governor of the Bank of England today. We want to make the Bank of England independent.
To their credit, the Treasury didn't blink much.
Obviously, it was important to show that we meant business in the first few days.
The Chancellor saw the Governor of the Bank of England on the Monday morning. The monthly monetary meeting took place on the Tuesday morning. And then the announcement took place to a very surprised press. I think it was at about 11 o'clock.
This is the time to take tough decisions, the tough decisions we need for the long-term interests and prosperity of the country. I have therefore decided to give the Bank of England operational responsibility for setting interest rates with immediate effect.
A revolution from Gordon Brown on his first full working day in office.
He said it was the most radical reform in the bank's 300-year history.
I mean, this was a big, unexpected, bold thing for a Labour Chancellor to do, to give away power.
The people of Britain elected this man to run the economy. The first full working day in office, and he gives control of interest rates and therefore mortgages to this man, the unelected Governor of the Bank of England.
We had to get rid of boom and bust. We had to get rid of this idea that instability in our economy was a feature of British life, and there had to be a break with the past.
Gordon's preoccupation upon coming into office was his fear of a crisis of confidence in the economy and markets, that there would be a capital flight, terrible pressure on the pound, as some previous Labour governments had experienced.
In the city, the pound rose and shares ended the day at another record high.
And that certainly preempted the risk of any crisis of confidence. I mean, the markets viewed it as a masterstroke. Actually, from the beginning of the government, there were in effect two centres of power, Number 10 and the Treasury.
What Gordon wanted was a partnership. He wanted it to be clear, but on economic and social policy, that was his domain.
But of course, in fact, there were three people, Gordon, Tony and Peter, were the main architects of New Labour. And so Peter felt very acutely that whereas Gordon was Chancellor and Tony was Prime Minister, he was simply a Minister of State in the Cabinet Office, and it wasn't fair.
It was such a far cry from what we had been before, the three musketeers, joined at the hip. After the election, straight away, it was almost as if we were now dividing into different camps, Brownites and Blairites. And I was caught rather painfully in the middle of all this.
Peter I was personally close to him. He was a great sounding board. He had as good judgment as anyone I've ever come across in politics. I mean, he was good, very good.
The way he put it to me was, look, we've got to bed down for the first year. You go and be minister without portfolio, or as Alistair Campbell called it, minister without a job, next door in the Cabinet Office, and after a year, we'll find something else for you to do. I had no alternative. I had just to carry on being Peter.
Labour's massive victory in the general election took visible shape in Parliament today as their new MPs overflowed the government benches.
Prime Minister. Madam Speaker-elect, there are many new faces, as you have said, for you to get used to. Indeed, there are many new faces for me to get used to.
You come into government, one of the disadvantages is inexperience, and one of the advantages is in a sense that sometimes in that inexperience you think you can do things that seem impossible.
Would my right honourable friend confirm that there's a particular responsibility on the part of the IRA to end their murderous and terrorist campaign, which has caused only pain and suffering and numerous deaths during the last 25 years?
No, I remember there was a Monday morning, and he sort of bounded into the offices, and he sort of said, I've worked out how to do Ireland. I've worked out how to do it.
I remember saying to him, do you know the full history of Northern Ireland? No, he said, because I was saying it's terribly difficult, as I would, being a good civil servant. And he was saying, no, but we can do it. I'm sure we can do it. And it was testing out his own private theory that he could make things happen when others had failed.
11 people have been killed in a huge bomb attack in Northern Ireland. More than 50 others are injured.
We were part of the United Kingdom. We shared with the rest of the United Kingdom the sorrows of war. It is a patriotic duty of Irish men and Irish women to engage in that legitimate armed struggle.
The Sinn Fein MP, Gerry Adams, has told a Republican protest rally that it's the patriotic duty of Irish people to engage in armed struggle against British rule.
An IRA bomb exploded without any warning at lunchtime today, killing 9 people and injuring another 57.
I worked as a journalist with the BBC and with the Belfast Telegraph in Northern Ireland for more years than I care to remember. Every day, what you dreaded was some news just in. Some news just in meant bad news, never good news.
The IRA brought their most destructive weapon to the streets of London.
A massive explosion tonight shook the London Docklands.
I mean, I've been near 5 bombs in my career in Whitehall, which is quite extraordinary, really. Most of us had baggage from Northern Ireland, which actually made it more difficult.
What was lacking was the engagement of the Northern Ireland political parties with each other. And that was the challenge, if you like, facing Tony Blair. Could he crack that nut of getting the parties around the same table, never mind agreeing with each other?
The Prime Minister flew to Northern Ireland today to try to break the deadlock in the peace process there.
Northern Ireland for me, it was a very personal thing. My mother was Southern Irish Protestant. Before the Troubles started in the 60s, we would go to Ireland every year. And I'd grown up politically, and as an adult, waking up every morning to death and destruction of one sort or another, either in Northern Ireland or indeed in mainland Britain.
Cheering sunny Armagh greeted the Prime Minister, who arrived promptly at the city centre, and there were plenty there eager to greet the man and his new Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Mo Mowlam.
Mo was an extraordinary political figure. I mean, she spoke and operated like nobody else, and I felt that in the context of Northern Ireland, she played a very important role. The Nationalists and the Republicans could never feel, you know, they weren't dealing with some sort of stuck-up English aristocrat. They were dealing with a Labour feminist with a, let's say, a colourful turn of phrase.
I hope like the advantages I might bring to the job is a sensitivity in some senses, but at the same time, a directness and an openness.
We had decided, even before the election, that the first visit that Tony would make outside London would be to Northern Ireland to demonstrate how much he cared about the issue.
What made me sit up and take notice was when he said,
"It is a responsibility that weighs not just upon the mind, but upon the soul."
Not just on the mind, but upon the soul. I thought, he gets it. He knows this isn't just about pieces on a jigsaw. This is about the moral outrage of a society of 1.5 million people in which over 3,000 people had lost their lives.
My message to Sinn Fein is clear. You cannot hold the process to ransom any longer, so end the violence and end it now.
It wasn't right for a country like the UK, you know, which wanted to play a big role in international affairs and resolve issues elsewhere, that we had an unresolved, violent issue still in our midst. As long as that was the case, it was a prime responsibility of a Prime Minister to try to do something about that, to try and resolve that. For Tony Blair, the main thing on the international front was to make sure that Britain was seen as a big player again. And he calculated and manipulated his appearances on the international stage to show that Britain was back.
A landslide victory has made Britain's new Prime Minister a serious player in Europe, the new boy everybody wanted to meet. So how did he think his smile had gone down with his fellow leaders?
Well, a bit like the British electorate, I'm tempted to say, but I think that...
Tony, he saw himself as in a sense, a big man who wanted to go out and do big things in the world. He wasn't a sort of stay at home and mind the shop sort of Prime Minister.
Last week, Europe. This week, the world.
Just after the handover of Hong Kong, Tony said to Alistair and me, apropos of nothing really, we shouldn't lose any more territory. And we both looked at him and thought, what are you talking about? And he said, no, after Hong Kong, we mustn't lose any more territory. Britain's not big enough.
Britain needs to be big. I mean, look at a map, look at it. Britain is so small.
But you could argue that he got into international affairs because Gordon wasn't interested in them. That was when I first knew him. I thought that's the reason why he's doing it, is because Gordon leaves him alone to do it.
New Labour's first budget. Gordon Brown delivers New Labour's first budget, calling it a people's budget for Britain's future.
Previous budgets pursued the short-term interests of the few. This budget advances the long-term interests of the many.
Economic credibility was not everything, but it was so important. The economy is the route to our success.
Labour have also decided to match precisely the Tory commitments to tight public spending.
One big problem we obviously had by, one, sticking to the Tories' spending, and two, being very tough on not raising taxes, is we didn't have any money to spend. Well, Gordon was always good at coming up with long-term strategic thinking.
I say it is right that we employ the unfair profits of the privatised utility to pay for a fair deal for the unemployed.
So in the case of the privatised utilities, he spotted that they were unpopular and he spotted a chance to get some money out of them.
Every voter was fed up with money that they were paying for their water or their gas or their electricity going into shareholders or chairmen's salaries.
Cedric Brown, leaving home this morning in Buckinghamshire, earns £475,000 a year. He says he has a stressful job.
The way the utilities had been privatised was to have them underpriced, under-regulated, and of course Conservative ministers had moved over from being the privatisers to being on the boards of these privatised companies. So it was a very difficult thing for the Conservatives to defend.
Come on, Cedric. You've had the wage bill. You don't left for workers.
Every time you have a bath, a shower, have a cup of tea, watch the television, you have to use their water or their electricity services. This is a licence to print money.
They acted so irresponsibly, it was just a gift for us, a gift carried on giving. The tabloids loved all this. People didn't realise what we were up to, but what we're really up to is making them so unpopular that when Gordon announced a windfall tax on the privatised utilities, everyone would say, what a jolly good idea. And it worked.
I have to say the highlight of the Queen's speech for me after the election was when the Queen stood up in all her regalia and announced
a welfare to work programme to tackle unemployment, financed by a levy on the excess profits of the privatised utilities.
I mean, that sentence, I can hear the Queen saying it now, which was just amazing.
A people's budget for Britain's future, and I commend it to the House and to the country.
We got 2 million young people into work. We got 2 million adult unemployed into work. I mean, millions of people benefited from the fact that we charged what was actually probably quite generous to the utilities, $5 billion in taxation.
He would never take no for an answer. Every budget, the day after the budget, I'd get called round and he'll say, what are we going to do next year? And you say, Gordon, we have 364 days before the next budget. Can we not have a day off? But when he had a mission, he really wanted to deliver it.
Now, this did cause problems later. People in Tony's office mainly resented that he had so much power.
I was in bed, and the pager went at early hours, and it said, car crash in Paris, Dodie dead, die in hospital, capital letters, this is not a joke.
A short while ago, Buckingham Palace confirmed the death of Diana, Princess of Wales.
Tony rang quite early in the morning, and he just said, this is enormous doings. That was a great phrase of his, doings, big doings or small doings. And he just said, this is enormous doings.
Prime Minister, can we please have your reaction to the news?
I feel like everyone else in this country today. People everywhere, not just here in Britain, everywhere, they kept faith with Princess Diana. They liked her, they loved her. They regarded her as one of the people. She was the people's princess. And that's how she will stay, how she will remain.
That People's Princess quote reflected what we knew about the public. We'd only been campaigning just weeks before. We'd only just won this general election. We were only just in power. So we sort of felt this mood of the nation. We had modernised ourselves. But there was a sense that perhaps the royal family had not modernised itself enough. And that is immediately what the press were onto.
The criticism is unprecedented and unsparing. The tabloids united in articulating a sense that the royal family doesn't appear in step with what they believe is the nation's feelings.
I think it's disgusting. The Queen actually hasn't made a speech.
The whole country feels badly let down.
I could feel the anger building, and I wanted to assuage it fast. My instinct was that the royal family had to show that they were coming to the people with some understanding of how they felt, so that the country didn't end up feeling, and at one point I think it could have, that this was a moment of choice between the traditions of the monarchy and this new spirit.
The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh arrived back in London to see for themselves the sea of flowers which now laps the gates of Buckingham Palace, and to meet the crowds who'd so wanted their return.
It's fantastic to see her back at home. Believe me, all the nation's forgiven her now.
In the autumn after the elections, Tony Blair's approval ratings was stratospheric. But at the same time, Gordon Brown was motoring at the Treasury. There was, Bank of England independence, the New Deal for the unemployed, the windfall tax. So the Blair-Brown relationship was working incredibly effectively. Their complementary skills and complementary agendas were really powerful for the government.
It was a time of possibility, of excitement, and of optimism. There was a sense that a new type of progressive politics could shape the future.
Comes round for the curfew.
Tony and Gordon, they were, the zeitgeist. They were in tune with what people wanted to do, their aspirations, that we weren't stupid. We did know that this was the honeymoon period and that it would not last.
The European Commission President, Jacques Santer, has urged Britain to join a European single currency in the first wave.
The speculation about whether or when Britain might join is now intensifying. Next May, Tony Blair chairs the summit which will decide who can take part.
With the euro, I'd no doubt at all that was Britain's clear destiny. All around the world, regions were coming together. So for me, Britain being at the heart of Europe was essential, and the euro fitted into that.
Look, we had a difficulty over the euro, and that was a policy difference.
Isn't EMU now falling apart?
I think Gordon had come to the conclusion that at some stage we needed to make it clear that as a country we would not go into the euro.
I agreed with Tony. There was huge political advantages for Britain actually being part of the euro. But there was also economic drawbacks. Our economic cycle was different from that of Europe. The financial services industry was quite unique. My fear was that we would have a recession immediately we went into the European Euro arrangement.
Gordon and Tony discussed this at length. Tony and Peter Mandelson probably had a different view.
Like Tony, I felt that if we did not eventually find ourselves in the euro, then our position in Europe and our influence in Europe, our ability to shape Europe's destiny would be constrained. The problem arose when press stories started appearing, alluding to differences between Number 10 and the Treasury. Press stories had emanated from the Treasury. A press briefing then took place by Gordon's press aide, Charlie Whelan, delivered from the Red Lion pub in Whitehall, which left no ambiguity at all. Basically, journalists were told that the whole matter was closed for the duration of the Parliament.
Good evening. The government's given the strongest indication yet that Britain will not join the European single currency during the life...
When he learned of this, Tony was absolutely staggered. And he and I spoke. He said, I've got to speak to Gordon about this. And he got switched to find in the Chancellor to talk to about this. And in the Treasury, he was put through not to the Chancellor, but to Charlie Whelan.
Unfortunately, Tony Blair wasn't quite prepared for this, so he was ringing me up. I was in the pub, the Red Lion.
And he said to Charlie, what on earth is going on in this?
What's going on, Charlie? What's going on? You're saying we're not going in the euro. I said, well, we're not.
Across Europe tonight, Britain's manoeuvring will be viewed with dismay. During recent talks at the EU offices in Luxembourg, diplomats had thought the government was sounding more enthusiastic about monetary union.
I think Gordon, he didn't know who his true friends were. He didn't know who to rely on, and that pushed him towards a group of people, who encircled his wagon. They became a sort of Praetorian guard for Gordon, and they were pretty tough, and they lashed out. They thought they needed to defend him very ferociously and to support his position.
I think we were very constrained by that debacle, the whole Red Lion crisis. And once we got stuck at that stage in the first term on the euro, it was very hard to recover from that.
When I took up the job, I remember Peter Mandelson said to me, Charlie Whelan must go. And then he sent me a note saying, I've heard nothing from you. Do I take it he's going? I had no mandate to sack him. And then I discovered that because Charlie Whelan was a special advisor, he only held the position with the agreement of the Prime Minister. So I was able to say to the Prime Minister, it's up to you. You can just withdraw the consent, tell Gordon, and that's it. And he looked at me and said, I'm not sure I can say that to Gordon.
Anyway, look, I'm not going to spend all afternoon arguing with you, but if you wrote anything other than we will be tough on public spending, I'm going to come and beat you up.
Charlie was somebody who was up to all sorts of stuff. He might have thought was helping Gordon, but I think was damaging the government and therefore actually was damaging Gordon as well.
Every other press officer in every other department would have to bow and scrape to Alistair Campbell, and I didn't have to.
People often talk about Tony and Gordon. It was quite often the underlings. It was the people underneath them. So you've got Alistair, you've got, they all had sort of big, I hesitate to use the word like, what can I use? I mean, not rotting stags exactly, but, these were big, egotistical guys. And they wanted to, make sure that their men, their bosses' views were presented in the best possible way, and they got a slight kick out of that themselves.
Alistair was sort of fearsome. I mean, where he felt the government's interests were at stake, he would fight for them, and he would brook no opposition, and he took no hostages.
After the Red Lion pub, I think there was a little bit of aggression. We all could see at 1,000 paces how it could escalate.
Tony Blair's arrival at Castle Buildings to meet Sinn Fein President Gerry Adams was billed as historic. This was the first time a British Prime Minister met a Republican leader in 76 years.
You were going to meet people who had, metaphorically or physically, blood on their hands.
My father had been shot in a IRA ceasefire and injured. My brother had been on their death list for 8 years. I didn't feel very warm and cuddly about them.
The meeting itself was uneventful, rather brief, 15 or 20 minutes. Nothing of great substance was said.
The Sinn Fein president said his point of view was unchanged.
We, of course, want to see the maximum change. We want to see Irish unity. We want him to be the last British Prime Minister with jurisdiction in Ireland.
But it was very important to break that ice, to make the point that there could be meetings of this kind without the world coming to an end.
The Prime Minister was asked if he'd actually shaken hands with the Sinn Fein politicians.
I treated Gerry Adams and the members of Sinn Fein in the same way that I treat any human being.
And, I'd studied the Bobby Sands and the hunger strike and all of that. I thought, these people definitely believe in their cause, so if you disrespect them right from the very beginning, well, you're not going to make peace with them.
And I think what is important about the situation here in Northern Ireland is that we do actually treat each other as human beings.
After being greeted by the Lord Mayor, Tony Blair's historic day took a traditional turn for visiting Prime Ministers.
The grannies. I remember it well. All these very nice, cheerful shoppers. And then I just picked up immediately. There's a change of mood here. My antennae just went, whoa.
It brought home to me. Yep, they really don't like each other, that's for sure.
And local police took him by his arms and rushed him out of there.
He has the blood of innocent people on his hands, Gerry Adams, and there's no way we want a Prime Minister like that in Northern Ireland.
Would the Prime Minister today explain to the people of Northern Ireland how he can argue that he must meet Gerry Adams tomorrow with 3 members of an outlawed army council? And is he not aware that these very members were the members that were there when Downing Street was blown up and an attempt was made to kill the previous cabinet of this country?
Gerry Adams' supporters waved Irish tricolours outside Downing Street, and when the Sinn Fein president arrived, they cheered him on, their voices battling with those of anti-IRA protesters.
Smash! Smash the IRA! Smash!
A Sinn Fein delegation was invited into Downing Street today for the first time in 3/4 of a century.
It was just before Christmas. I remember Alistair Campbell sending me a memo saying, don't you think we should remove the Christmas tree outside Downing Street? We don't want terrorists posing in front of a Christmas tree.
You had the security people. I could tell we're having kittens about every time these guys went for a pee and how long they're staying in there and what they're doing. And
one of the key things, obviously, was to be able to look into the eyes of Adams and McGuinness and judge, are they sincere about this? Do they really want peace? Do they really want to change? Or is it a gigantic con?
Martin McGuinness particularly was the kind of soul of the Republican movement a little bit more. And a lot of those first meetings were really me listening to Martin explain what it was like to be a Republican and why they felt that the British had treated the Irish so badly. And they were then able to go back to their people and say, no, we're sitting in Downing Street around the cabinet table with that guy, and we're telling him how we feel.
All of us have to learn about how to move from the old failed agenda. We shouldn't underestimate the difficulties. At the same time, this was a good moment.
And I was lucky at the time because I had the political space to do it. It wasn't causing me huge problems.
It's probably the most uncomfortable chapter of Mr. Blair's premiership.
£1 million mess. How can New Labour have allowed itself to become entangled in old problems of sleaze and secrecy?
the exempting of Formula One racing from the proposed ban on tobacco advertising after a hefty contribution to Labour funds from motor racing chief Bernie Ecclestone has stirred accusations that he'd bought influence.
When I made a contribution, it was in January this year. There was nobody talking about tobacco or anything.
The Ecclestone affair was just one of those occasions where you find yourself walking a tightrope. We took a hit over that because mud sticks.
One of the things you learn about politics is that scandal comes in all shapes and sizes.
Do you believe that as a result of what has happened in this past week or so, you have lost the trust of the British people?
No, I don't believe that. I would never do anything either to harm the country or anything proper. I never have. I think most people who have dealt with me think I'm a pretty straight sort of guy, and I am.
To this day, I'm never quite sure the right way to deal with these things.
There is no more important relationship in government than the one between Chancellor and Prime Minister, and few things more corrosive than when number 10 and 11 Downing Street fall out.
The problem is that the Prime Minister's friends are talking privately about the Chancellor having, quote, psychological flaws.
It was vindictive. It was abhorrent. It was a personal slur.
What is happening here is the spin doctors in number 10 Downing Street hate the spin doctors in number 11. The sources, meaning Blair's sources, blaming the Treasury now for the government's single currency policy. Brown's move was a serious and silly move designed to weaken the government.
Anyone who had a ringside view of the Blair-Brown relationship realised the tensions were often exacerbated by the people around those two politicians.
Did it get out of control? Yes, it did.
Could you just confirm to me that you have never said, and you're not aware that anyone in your office has said of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, that he's psychologically flawed? Can you give?
I can. I know that it has been that it's me.
You don't know
that's
who
been.
said it?
I don't know. I don't. I've always accurately denied saying that phrase about Gordon. But I did say something to Andrew Rawnsley that justified him writing that I was saying things about Gordon Brown that I shouldn't have done.
When that happened, I was seeing Gordon every day, and so we were talking with each other. And obviously, I think he was angry about the article, which, you know, why shouldn't he be? But it didn't really disturb the relationship much. It's just it's an utterly unproductive waste of energy. Yeah, we discussed at the time and just moved on for it.
Tony's great skill was making people think that he was listening and appreciating what they were saying, allowing people to leave thinking that he agreed with them and that they were leaving having found an agreement with the Prime Minister when actually they hadn't. Now, when you're feeling the stones and treading very carefully through a sort of minefield, you know, that has huge advantages. Like Northern Ireland, for example, the way in which Tony conducted diplomacy there was quite masterful.
Tony Blair's going to Northern Ireland today to try to get the peace process moving again.
The talks ran into crisis, with Ulster Unionists and Loyalists flatly rejecting the outline of a deal.
As one of the political leaders put it, Prime Minister, better get over here quick, or else there's going to be nothing to come over for. A poll carried out just before the talks found that only 13% of people thought they would succeed in the time frame. 87% didn't. It was just the learnt pessimism of a quarter of a century of failure.
When I got there, David Trimble said to me, "There's absolutely no way I'm signing this. It's an outrage." The Sinn Fein people said they weren't going to sign it in any event, whatever happened.
We hadn't intended to do a press conference, but Alistair decided that Tony should say something to the press. So instead of giving him time to think, we just pushed Tony straight back to the waiting cameras.
A day like today, I mean, it's not a day for sort of sound bites, really. We can leave those at home, but I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder.
And Alistair and I dissolved into giggles.
In fact, I remember when he came back from saying that, I said, what's that about? Hand of history.
Saying the hand of history is upon our shoulder is not the way to lower expectations.
And then we spent the next 3 days in the most intense negotiation I've ever been in my life, literally all day and most of the night, for 3 days.
This was an enormous agenda. This was ambition.
Power sharing, north-south bodies.
Decommissioning, policing.
Dismantling the security apparatus that had grown up for 30 years.
There's got to be equality and there's got to be consent.
And what to do about prisoners.
This was a government that recognised that you had to address all those issues at once, in the same place, at the same time. That's what distinguished it from every other attempt by the British government for the previous quarter of a century.
I felt conceptually we had something that in a rational world, at least, should be agreed. Northern Ireland stays part of the UK, but that nationalist aspiration is recognised and everyone's happy.
We actually got into trouble almost immediately.
The list had been produced of north-south bodies. This is the bodies which are going to set up to encourage cooperation between Northern Ireland and the Republic. The Unionists went completely ballistic as soon as they saw the list because it was far too long and far too substantive from their point of view. So they said, we're not touching this with a 40-foot pole.
Here, my relationship with the Taoiseach Bertie Ahern was very important. I mean, he was, willing to push his own system in the way that I was pushing mine.
I believe that people are determined. I think they all assured me last night that they're prepared to make the necessary moves that can put this all in place, and hopefully they are.
Blair said, look, unless you can do something on this subject, we're wasting our time. And Bertie Ahern recognised the importance of that, and he did it.
Once we were past that, we had a very difficult negotiation with Adams, who wanted his prisoners released after 1 year. These were people who committed murder. Tony managed to give him an assurance that if he really, really needed the 1 year after the agreement, we would try and meet that, but the agreement would have to be 2 years.
We were constantly firefighting for all those 3 days, because as soon as you thought you'd sorted out a problem here, as soon as the other side heard about it, they went off the other end.
Working literally around the clock.
Everyone was fraying at the edges, and that, of course, is one of the ways you succeed in a negotiation.
The midnight deadline was missed, and as Easter snow fell on Stormont in the small hours, it really is the last lap.
At points it looked as if we'd lost the whole thing.
The Unionists say they'll take as much time as they need to scrutinise the final document.
David Trimble made it clear he could not accept this agreement because it was not sufficiently clear on weapons. Tony told me to quickly draft a side letter from him to David Trimble, and I ran downstairs, but I discovered that the door to the Unionists' office was locked. And eventually I managed to persuade them by sticking a note under the door to get them to let me in. And I handed this letter to Trimble, who was at the top table, and John Taylor, who was crucial in this, said, yep, that will do. And I went rushing back upstairs and told Tony we quickly went for the plenary, even though everyone was absolutely exhausted, to get it pinned down before it's too late.
A historic agreement for peace in Northern Ireland has been reached within the past few minutes. We can see pictures now from Stormont.
This agreement is good for the people of Ireland, North and South. It was made possible by the leadership, the commitment, the personal negotiating skill of Prime Minister Tony Blair and the Taoiseach Bertie Ahern.
I want to say this to the politicians and to the people of Northern Ireland with all the force that I can muster. Even now, this will not work unless in your will and in your mind you make it work.
Tony Blair says in his autobiography that I said that he succeeded in Northern Ireland because he had a messianic complex.
Unless we extend the hand of friendship to those who were once foes. Unless, before we condemn, we at least try to see the other side.
It was more something that Mo Molan said to me, which was that Tony thought he was effing Jesus, which is not quite the same as a messianic complex, but is related. He believed that this was a really big existential problem for Britain, and he believed he could solve it.
I said when I arrived here on Wednesday night that I felt the hand of history upon us. Today, I hope that the burden of history can at long last start to be lifted from our shoulders.
And then we jumped in the cars and raced off and suddenly thought, my God, we've done it. I mean, we hadn't brought peace to Northern Ireland, but, you know, we'd actually made a very important step on the way.
If we thought when we took off in our helicopters on the morning of Good Friday we solved the problem of Northern Ireland with the Good Friday Agreement, sadly we hadn't. Sectarianism actually got worse after the Good Friday Agreement rather than better.
There was the worst atrocity in the history of the Troubles at Omagh.
It was a really long road to actually getting to implementing peace.
There was nothing guaranteed about the agreement when it was signed. That only happened because he kept at it. He kept at it and kept at it and kept at it and kept at us to keep at it every day. And that's why, 20 years after the agreement, despite all the difficulties, the framework it established is still there. My children grew up in a world which I just didn't know. I didn't have to worry about them going into the centre of Belfast. I didn't have to worry about some news just in.
Hello, can everybody hear me? Would you please take your seats, please?
In an address in the garden of Downing Street, the Prime Minister maintained they'd made a good start on fulfilling election promises.
Thank you and welcome everyone here. Sometimes the revolution is a quiet revolution, but a revolution nonetheless it is.
We had a reshuffle in July 98. Tony Blair would look at the balance, not only of talent, but of loyalties. How do we reduce the influence of the Brownites and increase the influence of the Blairites?
Tony Blair's ministerial reshuffle is still going on, but after this morning's comings and goings in Downing Street, it's clear who some of the winners and losers are. Peter Mandelson, who's expected to enter the cabinet for the first time at Trade and Industry.
You know what my new post is?
No one's more loyal than Peter Mandelson. In Labour mythology, he's Tony Blair's favourite advisor, cheerleader, spy and political hitman.
As one MP put it, more Blairist than Blair.
Mr. Mandelson, what's the message behind the reshuffle? Can't hear what you're saying.
I was just thrilled to bits to be going to a department. I wanted to get well away from the shadows, the spin machine, you know, the troubleshooting, being Peter for Tony. When I went to the DTI, and I had a very strong vision of building a new economy, a modern economy.
I think Peter was one of the most able ministers in the Blair-Brown years, if not the most able. I think he was outstanding.
You will always get from me honesty, straight talking, and candour. No more spin, honest.
Many MPs will study this reshuffle for signs of a power game between Tony Blair and the Chancellor Gordon Brown. Downing Street insists it's nothing of the kind, though it's widely believed Mr Brown didn't want to see Peter Mandelson at the Cabinet Office in a position to challenge his power.
This is, in fact, a slap in the face to some extent for Gordon Brown. In The Independent, Blair tightens grip as Brown feels the squeeze. In The Times, Cabinet reshaped in Blair's image, Chancellor reined in.
Well, of course, it's about power and obsessive behaviour that makes them want to be in control of everything, control freakery.
I don't believe that situation in the crew is sustainable. You've got two people
Peter Mandelson and Gordon Brown at the heart of economic policy making, who, frankly, whose supporters certainly loathe each other.
I think they have deep-rooted personal animosities which will keep their teeth locked firmly in each other's throats for the foreseeable future. And, jolly good copy it will continue to make for all of us.
It is the most serious embarrassment yet to hit the Blair administration, elected on the promise of being as beyond reproach as Caesar's wife. Mandelson himself took an undeclared loan of £373,000 from Geoffrey Robinson.
Technically, I should have declared the fact that a fellow Labour MP and a long-standing friend of mine had, before the election, given me a loan to buy a house, and I overlooked doing this. It wasn't secret. It wasn't even private. Many people knew about it.
We did not know anything about this loan.
How could we defend it? Well, we couldn't really.
People are saying that's not the kind of thing we expected from Labour. We wanted them to look rather more different from the Tories.
I hope that Tony would weather the storm. But he decided, I think probably because I was so close to him, that he couldn't really give me any allowance. And I think Alistair saw from a media point of view that the only way of closing down the story was to close me down.
After a day fighting off criticism over his loan from Geoffrey Robinson, the Trade and Industry Secretary is going.
Charlie Whelan, who was Gordon Brown's press aide, spun it, presented it to a hostile journalist.
Well, of course, I got blamed. Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell took the opportunity to tell people that it must have come from Gordon Brown's office. It didn't.
Good evening. It's about the worst Christmas present the Prime Minister could have wished for. His closest parliamentary confidant, part inventor of the very idea of New Labour, gives him a letter of resignation. New Labour's darkest day, the Times' front page, the Daily Telegraph, Blair shattered by loss, and the Sun has a spectacular front page, stuffed.
I was angry because I felt we'd lost a really good minister, and because it was the product of internal nonsense that were a distraction from the proper business of government. But, it's just the way it is. I mean, it was the same with Alistair. People were always trying to pull him away from me. And, you just realised in the end that's what happens. And it's a shame for them because they become a kind of lightning rod for you in a way. And it's not really ultimately about them, it's about you.
Right. Morning, Charlie. Morning. Still here? Yes, very so.
For quite some time, they were hostile towards me, and they saw it as a way to get rid of me.
What's your response to Michael Ancron this morning?
And I said to Gordon, look, I've become the story. And by that time, really, I think I'd fulfilled my function. Then I left.
What are you going to do now?
I'm going to get in the car and go home.
I can't actually move now.
There was a difference after Charlie Whelan had gone. And of course, Peter was out in the wilderness.
Does the disappearance of Peter Mandelson mean the end of New Labour as we've known it?
New Labour stays, and New Labour will always stay.
And there was a sense that we had to sort of regroup, resettle.
Mr. Blair denied his government was riven by factionalism, or that there were any problems between him and the Chancellor.
Everybody just needed to settle back down and get on with the job of government. I mean, this is Downing Street, this is not Coronation Street.
Welcome to the Millennium Dome, the focus of national celebrations.
Let us step up the pace now. Be confident as a political party. Be radical.
I would have preferred Gordon to be wholeheartedly for these things and with me all the way.
Where there were difficulties, I'm honest about them. I mean, tensions are the stuff, I'm afraid, of politics.
Of course, Gordon said, "You've stolen my fucking budget."
Yet more rumours have emerged that Mr. Brown is widening his power base.
I think it was becoming increasingly clear that Gordon and Tony had different visions of New Labour.